Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today is a familiar face on the program. He has been recently awarded the Lifetime Dedication to Kentucky History Award in Frankfort. He is John Robertson. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
To begin with, congratulations for the award.
Well, appreciate it.
And secondly, what got you so interested in the history of this great Commonwealth?
Well, being born in Kentucky had something to do with it. And it always seemed to me that we were ignored more than we should have been. Because, well, if you think about it, until about 1850, Kentucky played a significant role
Absolutely.
in many of the nation's events, going back to the Revolutionary War, for example. The fact that we had Fort Jefferson at what is now Wycliffe in 1780 gave the new Virginia, and then through that, the new United States, the right to navigate the lower Mississippi River. It established Kentucky's claim to the Mississippi. And we were also, well, the last of the old frontier, because the Jackson Purchase, well, before a town like Paducah was settled, Missouri had already come into the state. So the frontier had jumped across the Mississippi River. But we still had this little area down here that was unsettled because of a claim by a particular Indian tribe, the Chickasaw. So I guess that was it. I always felt that, well, we deserved more than we got. Of course, U.S. history for years was dominated by writers from New England. And so we know a whole lot about the Pilgrims, but very little about Kentucky and the frontier.
Well, I like to tell my students that Kentucky was the first Western state.
It is.
1792. We're the gateway to the West, and not taking anything away from St. Louis,
Or
but
the Old West.
The Old West, absolutely. And you think of people. Henry Clay had greater stature than many presidents of his era.
And if you think about it, George Rogers Clark, with 150 men, captured more territory for Virginia than existed in the all other colonies at the time in the American Revolution, 1778. So everything north of the Ohio River and west of the mountains is a part of the United States due to a Virginian, and of course Kentucky was a part of Virginia, becoming a county of Virginia in 1776. So that's ignored so much because it was the far west, but it had long-reaching repercussions. I think that was it. The deed was small compared to other things, but it was significant.
It was a great military campaign if you look at that, and you're right, it doesn't get the publicity it should. Between the time I invited you to come on the program and the time the program came on, we had some rather earth-shaking news here. An earthquake. And that made me think, and you too, I'm sure, about the great shakes of 1811 and 1812. Talk about those earthquakes.
Well, in particular, the one in 1811, we actually have eyewitness accounts. And so, it's chilling to read some of the things they talk about. We know that church bells rang in Boston. It was felt in Santa Fe. We know that chimneys fell in Cincinnati. And yet, there's very few people in this area. A little settlement at New Madrid, and that was about it at the time. But the magnitude of it is just blows the mind. There was a man and his wife, Nicholas Roosevelt, who had left Pittsburgh on the first steamboat on the Ohio River to New Orleans. And they were coming down en route to New Orleans. And they had to stop at Louisville because she gave birth to a boy there. And then they shot the rapids, much like George Rogers Clark had earlier, during an eclipse, as if that were some omen. And they arrived at the mouth of the Ohio just in time for the New Madrid earthquake. And so, she wrote her experiences and published it later in a journal.
Where could we find a copy of that? If somebody
Filson Club has one.
Filson Club has one. Has it been reprinted?
Oh, it's
published?
yes, it's been published
So
a time or two.
in public libraries?
Yes, the reprint is in the Filson Club. The original, I don't know.
Right.
But it was published sometime later by one of her family, at least.
Uh-huh.
So I read it in Louisville. The town of New Madrid, I think, if I'm right, been a long time, it sank maybe 4 feet.
Wow.
And the soil in that area is still, it has a sand underneath of soil on top, and it's prone to having what I call blowholes, where pressure builds up and suddenly you have a water spout popping up in the middle of a cotton field over in Missouri. During the 1811 earthquake, they reported seeing whole trees shoot up out of the ground. They've been buried
rockets
for 100 years.
Yeah.
They just pop up like a shot out of a cannon.
Yeah.
And some of these were 2 and 3 feet in diameter. Can you imagine the force of that?
No.
So we sit on one of the major tectonic plates here in the New Madrid fault area. Mm-hmm. And it's, of course, you can't predict an earthquake, although we had, just recently in the 1960s, was it? We had the prediction of a major earthquake.
Yeah, it might have been the 70s or 80s. Anyway, it's been a while ago, right?
Been a good while ago.
Yeah.
Everybody got, I can still see bottles of water. I think I have gallon jugs of water in my garage still. You prepared for the worst.
Right. Another story connected to that earthquake in 1811 was the story that the Mississippi River ran backwards.
And it did, in part. That would have been below Cairo, because what happened was, there's a grand story here. 1811, remember, the War of 1812 was coming up.
Right.
At that time, there was a Shawnee who was trying to organize a confederation of all the Indians in the West to oppose the further expansion of the whites. Mm-hmm. His name was
Tecumseh.
Tecumseh,
Yes.
And he had his brother.
The prophet.
The prophet.
Tenskwatawa or
Tenskwatawa.
Yeah, right.
And what they were doing was, since Tecumseh's mother was a Creek, and so he had connections with the 5 civilized tribes, which would be the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Creek and the whatever else, Seminole and Choctaw. He had gone down to visit his mother's people just before this earthquake. And his mother's brother, I believe, was the chief at the time, and this is the story. I don't know it's a historic fact, but it's a good story nevertheless. Mm-hmm. He visited them and asked for their help and was turned down. And he was furious. He said, I'm going back to where he lived, and when I get back there, I'm going to stomp my foot, and the earth will shake, and you will be destroyed. And they were. Mm-hmm. It was a great earthquake. So now, whether that is it's a
good story anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, Tecumseh went ahead and was killed in the fighting in the Battle of the Thames.
And that, of course, creates another great Kentucky hero, Colonel Richard M. Johnson.
Yeah, Ronley Bonley.
What a great story that is. Getting back to the earthquake, it also formed Reelfoot Lake, did it not?
That's where the water was rushing. That's why the Mississippi ran the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. You had this huge, I want to say syncline. Is that the word?
I don't know.
It's one or the other.
Yeah.
Where the earth shifts its layer due to the shift in the fault. Mm-hmm. And this huge hole appeared and just devoured the whole trees and everything else went down this hole. Mm-hmm. And, of course, something had to come in and fill it. Mm-hmm. And Reelfoot Lake is the result.
Mm-hmm. And that's incredible when you think of that. You go and you stand and look at the Mississippi, all that water, all that power to reverse the course of that thing, it must have been something.
That was an act of nature that we haven't seen anything like it since.
And hope it'll be a while yet.
Yes, and of course was such a major one that if you really want to worry, we're coming up on the 200th anniversary. Well, it's also in 1811, 1812, so we won't have to worry, because I think it's in 2012 the world's going to end anyhow.
Well, that's
the Maya
to know.
calendar.
Yeah, that's comforting to know. Right, yeah. Getting back to Kentucky, one of the things that fascinates me in teaching their survey course in Kentucky, in the 1790s, when we become a state, in the pioneer period, Kentucky is the place you want to be. Huge population explosion. There was a minister who was trying to describe heaven to his congregation and called it a Kentucky kind of place. Well, we're now in the year 2008, and I think I'm a native Kentuckian as well, that our reputation has suffered a bit since then. One of the things about Kentucky that we almost have this fierce pride of being unlettered. It's sort of the attitude, I'm ignorant, my daddy's ignorant, my grandpa's ignorant, my kid's going to be ignorant. And you see that in our attitude toward education. Do you see any improvement in that as an educator that you were?
Well, Kentucky has always been looked at more for what is in eastern Kentucky as the image of the hillbilly and everything like that. Although in this area, unfortunately, one section also, they deliberately tried to smear them into appearing as if they were idiots and rubes and incestual marriages and all of that. The land between the lakes.
Right.
And that was in part trying to, run them out and take up their property. So I think we've gotten a bad rep. Of course, we deserve some of it.
Well, you go back, and one of the things I remember, right after World War II, there was a famous survey of various, it was business and government and labor groups, all sorts of groups. We either led the league or were very close in illiteracy. We still either lead the league or we're very close in lowest percentage of college graduates in the population, that we've never really emphasized education. And again, things are better.
Well, that's the current image.
Right.
You have to remember in the pioneer period
Lexington.
We had the second largest university in the United States, Transylvania.
And the first built west of the Appalachian Mountains.
And first west of the Appalachian Mountains. We also were a leader in public education. 1837, Robert Breckinridge as a superintendent. Kentucky was just barely squeezed out by Massachusetts as being the state founding public education. And still, we also have this peculiar thing of thinking that we're a southern state when we were never that. We were a border state.
Always.
And that we get this image, as you say, fixed of Kentuckians in people's minds. And of course, that's served us ill for a long time.
Well, and you think of the image, and I ask my students, have you had an out of Kentucky experience when you go someplace, even Illinois or Indiana, and they hear your accent and people smile, there are all sorts of assumptions made. First they see, do you have on shoes? Are you married to your first cousin? Do you have a house full of children who are not very bright because the gene pool is shallow? The stereotypical Kentuckian, bib overalls, sitting on the porch of his old ramshackle cabin, and he's got a shotgun and a jug of whiskey, and his wife is out there plowing. It's this image that is so pervasive, and it's really taken a long time to overcome that.
Well, we have inherited a great deal of that, of course, from, of course, here I am, a Western Kentuckian, blaming the Eastern Kentucky for the hillbilly image. But we've earned our own down in this area. Of course, we have one of the greatest moonshining areas in the state.
Oh, yeah.
Around Golden Pond.
Right.
But we were a little more technologically advanced.
That's true.
We had, they flew whiskey out of here by airplane to Cicero. They had regular runs for a truck, a white truck with a big sign on the side that said milk.
Well,
And it had Golden Pond moonshine.
right.
And Golden Pond moonshine was, now in making whiskey, you can do it 2 or 3 different ways. Do you know the difference between singling and doubling?
Oh, yeah.
Singling is where you run it through the still once. And a lot of times when they're making quick moonshine for sale, they will speed up the mash, particularly in this part of the state, but they would do it for their customers up there in the north. They'd run it through the still once, and when they were fermenting the mash, they'd put horse manure in there to make it work faster. And that generated some reaction. And,
I suspect it would.
but for their own home consumption, they ran it through the still the second time. And so you drank Dublins at home and sent the singlings north.
Up north. Yeah, yeah.
So,
And again, and that is so much a part of our image is the moonshine. And of course, whiskey was made during Prohibition all over the country.
Oh, yes.
You can make it anywhere.
and what is really tragic to me, we get all of these good stories that identify only with Kentucky, but Kentucky gave whiskey back to the United States. And if you think about it, the greatest manufacturer of whiskey in 1780 was George Washington. So, it's a part of this.
Been to
whole
Mount
Virginia-
Vernon, talk about that.
yeah, but,
they do.
The Kentucky gift was, we were over the mountains. It was hard to find barrels suitable for whiskey, and the local legend is they would take where dried fish would be sent down from Pittsburgh, and to get the fish smell out, they charred the inside, and then
Never heard that story.
Oh yeah,
That's
and
a
then they
wonderful
would put their whiskey in there, and it would.
Give it that beautiful amber color.
That's where, and a good Baptist minister started making bourbon whiskey.
Yes.
And it became
In Georgetown.
In Georgetown.
Which is the home of the Baptist Notre Dame.
Yeah, there you
Or
go.
as someone put it, Notre Dame is the Catholic Georgetown.
Yeah, there you go. So we have all of these images of Kentucky. We like to make fun of ourselves, but we've had people who made significant contributions.
Yes.
We have a Nobel winner here in Paducah. We have all kinds
A
of.
Nobel winner in Paducah. Who is that?
His sister has a shop downtown. I couldn't write about him because he's still alive.
Right. I
But
understand. Yeah.
we've also had people like, Davis, John Davis, Tillman,
Mm-hmm.
4 Point, valedictorian, goes to Georgia Tech, majors in engineering, 4 Point, goes to MIT, gets a master's, 4 Point, goes to the University of Pennsylvania College of Engineering, gets a PhD in nanotechnology, 4 Point. He becomes a trustee. All this from a Paducah boy. What he did was work for Bell Laboratories, and he made the mechanical technology, the switching that makes cell phones work.
And this fellow's name is, who did you say?
John Davis.
John Davis.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, we don't recognize what we have contributed.
Right.
And I think that's one of the shortcomings of our history. We get history textbooks that have what? A whole lot about people from other parts of the country and tend to neglect our own. They teach Kentucky history, what is it now, the 3rd and 4th grade?
I don't know. It's in the grade schools. Yeah.
And, I think that is almost a crime
Yeah.
because they get a different view of
Sure.
what history is at that age.
Yeah.
At one time it was taught in the 8th grade.
I had it in the 8th grade.
Yeah, I did
Sure
too.
did.
And
Yeah.
you were a little more open to
Right. A little more sophisticated. Well, and of course, one thing too, and I try to stress this to my students, and I know you did with yours too, is before the Civil War, Kentucky is a very significant state. We have more electoral votes than a lot of states.
Well, by 1850, Kentucky was the leading state in the United States with Henry Clay's leadership.
Absolutely. And again, this is, and then you go to the Civil War. Now, Lincoln may not have said this, but you know the old story. I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. But he did say that Kentucky was the key to holding the border states in. If Kentucky goes out, I lose Missouri, I lose Maryland, and so on and so forth. So both sides definitely saw this state as an asset.
Oh, yes, and Kentucky at that time was in a quandary because, you see, the Democrats had just won the 1859 election, and Beriah McGoffin was governor, and the man who was to be lieutenant governor was Lynn Boyd from Paducah.
Right. Buried in Oak Grove Cemetery.
And he died before he could be sworn in. So at the time, Kentucky, the Speaker of the House, Robertson, was a vehement opponent of McGoffin, and McGoffin wouldn't step down because he was pro-South, and because he didn't want Robinson to become the governor. So, well.
And I think that is one aspect of Kentucky history that people who are not particularly interested in history are fascinated by, is in Kentucky, this is truly the brother against brother, father against son.
Yes.
Whereas I tell my students, you're from Alabama, you're a Confederate. You're from Ohio, you're a Union man. In Kentucky, it's very, very, even Clay had
Well, the funny thing
both
about
sides.
it, if you look at the rosters, every state in the Union was represented in the Union Army. Every state in the Union was represented in the Confederate Army.
Oh, yeah.
So, it was, but in Kentucky, we had General Breckinridge, John Cabell Breckinridge for the South. His brother fought for the North, and they opposed each other on the battlefield. So,
And his uncle Robert was the leading Union man.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, when I talked to my students, I said, this is not like you root for UK and your dad's for U of L. This is serious business. This is a war.
Right. And most people don't know that Kentucky, we were occupied by the Confederates, but they were the invaders. When Leonidas Polk decided to take Hickman, he broke that truce that had been in existence, that Lincoln allowed to continue. And so as soon as that happened, word reached a new general who had just taken command over at Cairo, and without orders, he made an independent decision. He loaded up 4 regiments, put them on a steamboat, and sent a word to his commander in St. Louis,
Fremont.
Johnny Fremont.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to, unless I'm recalled.
Right.
And he couldn't recall him
Right,
because
exactly.
he was out of touch with the
Right.
telegraph office.
Right.
So he said, I'm going to take Paducah. And he did the next morning. And the Confederates were expected here at noon. Grant got here at daylight. And by that act, Kentucky then voted to remain in the Union. So he preserved Kentucky. And yet, despite that, Paducah was always treated with some suspicion by the people who were stationed here. Classic story. There was a general here everybody hated.
E.A. Payne.
No, Eleazer A. Payne.
Yeah, from Ohio.
And by the way, you go to the city records and you read there, they spell his name P-A-I-N.
Yes, they dropped
but
the E.
I
Right.
think they knew how to spell it.
Yeah, yeah.
But he had a young staff officer who had just come in and joined him from Michigan. And he's writing home to his mother. And he's saying, well, I wanted something to do on Sunday, so I decided to go to church. And the biggest church in town is Broadway Methodist. So I went there. And by the way, that was the first church in Paducah. And he said, I looked around at all the young ladies, and they were wearing gray. They were wearing anything but blue. There wasn't a blue coat in the whole building. So, we had the reputation of being almost dangerous.
Well, Paducah was called the Charleston of
Yeah.
Kentucky and the Purchase of the South Carolina of Kentucky and all that
But
stuff.
during the war, when Payne takes over after the two raids by Nathan Bedford Forrest, Payne cracks down on all these sympathizers. Did you know they rounded up the families of Southern sympathizers here in Columbus? They put them on a train under the guard of a black Union outfit, the 8th Heavy Artillery, parentheses, colored parentheses closed, and shipped them all the way to Detroit and threw them out and sent them to Canada. And some of those people still live there. I was at the Columbus Cemetery not long ago, and there were some people there looking around. I said, may I help you find something? And they said, well, no, our family were kicked out of Kentucky by Eliezer Payne. And they still remembered it and were coming back to look for their relatives here.
We have 2 minutes left, and there was a topic, if we could just address this quickly, is several years ago I heard a speech by Governor Patton. And regardless of what one thinks of Governor Patton, his various adventures or misadventures, one of the things he said that after the Civil War, he thought Kentucky made a terrible mistake in not industrializing like the states to the north did. Why did Kentucky stay agricultural and not join the Industrial Revolution?
That is a good question, because the main cash crop of Kentucky, one of the sources of cash was what? Tobacco.
Right.
And remains so for years, and that's agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need cheap labor. That's one of the reasons we had the Black Patch War here, because they were trying to
a boycott to get the price up, right.
Yeah.
But I thought that was really interesting that while Kentucky, and as you know, Kentucky doesn't significantly industrialize until really World War II or that period.
And yet they had some very major industries earlier than that. We had the shipyard here.
Right.
You had the bagging and rope walks in Lexington.
Mm-hmm.
You had
Students are always amused to know that hemp was a great.
Hemp was a big crop.
We were #1 hemp producer in the United States before the Civil War. But it struck me as interesting that, and I think that's a fascinating topic to look at as to why Kentucky did not industrialize in any appreciable way, whereas Ohio did, Indiana did, Illinois did.
Yeah.
And Patton said he thought that really held the state back.
I think he's right.
That didn't do that. So.
But we were comfortable with a high cash crop.
And that was, of course, tobacco. So, and we're out of time. Always goes fast. Come back again sometime.
Okay.
I'm Barry Craig. We hope you'll join us again next time. Thanks.